This is part 2 of the fiery furnace. For part 1, please go back to Pastor Tim's message from last week. It will give you a fuller picture. Now, for today, the passage found in Daniel chapter 3 will begin with verse 19. In your pew Bible is page 740. Page 740. 740. Chapter 3, verse 19. If you stand with me as we read together. Verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. An expression of his faith was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent, and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satrap, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed. Their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. You may be seated. The word of the Lord. Have you heard of the story of Herodias at the bridge? Really? All right. Well, according to Roman legend, sometime in the 6th century BC, almost about the same time of Daniel, the vastly superior Etruscan army marched against the city of Rome and decimated the Roman defense west of the city. The fleeing Romans ran for the wooden bridge over the Tiber River that led directly into the inner wall of the city. In the middle of the chaos, it became clear to both sides that this narrow bridge was all that stood between Rome and the conquering army. So soldiers and people of the city, they began to knock it down frantically. Now behind them, the entire Etruscan army was rushing toward this lower bridge. So everything came down to a race against time. In that desperate moment, one man turned and stood his ground. the one-eyed captain of the gate, Horatius. He held back the entire army at the entrance of the bridge, and the legend was born. It was memorializing a 19th century poem by the historian Thomas Macaulay. To every man upon this earth, death cometh soon or late. And how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods? Now, supposedly, Winston Churchill used to recite these lines to his war cabinet to steel their resolve. In Asia, there's a word for this. The Japanese call it Bushido. Bushido, the way of the samurai. The idea that you do what is honorable, no matter the cost, regardless of the result, even if it makes zero difference. Even if you face the certainty of death, especially if you face the certainty of death. Now, other people may call this suicidal mania. You know, I didn't know anything about Horatius until I met a friend. Anita and I, we used to attend this Chinese Christian retreat called New York Summer Conference. There was a perennial workshop speaker, a retired Marine, turned Reformed theologian, turned pastor, with the build of an NFL linebacker. Now, he and I were heading to lunch one time when a couple of students joined us and went on and on about the movie 300, which fictionalized the heroics of the ancient Spartans. Now, I watched my Marine friend, his eyes lit up, and he launched into the story of Horatius at the bridge. At one point, he recited from memory most of 3,000 words of the poem, with misty eyes and a lump in his throat. They weren't just words, they were life pouring out of his heart and soul. You know, when he got to the line, to every man upon this earth, death cometh sooner or late, I was pretty sure he grew like 2 feet taller. I saw the embodiment of the Marine motto, the materialization of the Marine motto, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. So I made 2 mental notes that day. Number 1, never mess with this guy. Number 2, if we were ever under attack, I want him at the bridge. Growing up in Asia during the Cold War, every man and boy wondered what it would take to live by the code of Bushido. The unspoken question lurking in the back of my mind was, what would I do if I were faced with a choice of self-preservation and honor? Now, as Christians, we face a similar question in the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What would it be like to be in their shoes? And what would I do if I were faced with a choice between denying Jesus in the fiery furnace? I wonder if I would have their courage. Or would I cave under pressure? Now, I've come to see that this may be the wrong question to ask. It's the wrong question to ask because it arises out of a story that we as human beings, apart from God, have been telling ourselves. Now, there are many variations of the story we tell ourselves with all different kinds of nuance, but the essence stays the same. It is not an exaggeration to say that the whole Bible was given to us in order to set the story straight. Last week, Pastor Tim preached part 1 of the fiery furnace, including the famous line of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If this be so, but if not. Now today we're picking up on verse 19. Verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. An expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. Now here King Nebuchadnezzar typifies exactly the kind of story that we all been telling ourselves one way or another. Now you say, what story is that? Well, it's the story of power and its struggle. The story of power and its struggle. It takes many forms. But the Bible tells a different story. Now, to set this up, I want to bring 3 other Old Testament texts into context. The first is about the beginning. And the second, the narrative arc of Israel's story. And the last one is Isaiah's prophecy. We're going to add that to this passage. For the first text, we go to Genesis chapter 1. Creation. Now, there are many interpretations about the 7 days of creation. But however we see it, I find it difficult to ignore the common ancient Near Eastern temple motif. There's a creation, a project, a structure, if you will, a heaven and earth structure in 6 stages plus 1. There's forming and filling of all kinds of things. And the last thing to go into the structure is an image. An image. Genesis 1. Then God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over such and such and such. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Then he ends with God's rest on the 7th day. This is the pattern of the temple motif. You see, temples in the ancient Near East were almost always dedicated following this pattern of 7-day ceremony. If you want to know more about this, you can just Google Bible Project. They explain all of that. But it's against that backdrop, Genesis tells us a unique story that turns all the stories of the world on its head. It says that the sun, moon, and stars, they're not gods. They're temple decorations. It says that the beasts of the field and the creatures of the sea are not deities. They have no dominion, no authority, and therefore can't be objects of our worship. In fact, God alone is the creator, and we alone are his image. God shares his dominion with us over the rest of creation, so we represent him as co-regents. And the purpose of the temple creation is so that he can come and dwell with us. Now, contrast that story with the story Nebuchadnezzar wants to tell in Daniel chapter 3. Here, the image of gold is clearly prominent. It's mentioned in verse 1, verse 2, twice in verse 3, verse 5, 7, 10, 12, 14, 15, and 18. A lot. But what exactly is it? What exactly is it? Is it Nebuchadnezzar? Is it Marduk, the Babylonian god, or another god? Or is it something else entirely? We don't know. We don't know. Now, what we do know is that Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2 had him thinking about the head of gold, about human empires, human power, and the struggles of kings and kingdoms. In chapter 3, as Pastor Tim showed us last week, Nebuchadnezzar sets out to be more than just the head of gold. He sets up an entire statue of gold, which he compels everyone, everywhere, to worship. Why? Because he can. And because this galvanizes all peoples, nations, and languages under his name. That sounds familiar? This is Nebuchadnezzar's Tower of Babel. I am not going to be just the head of gold. No, I'm going to say the word, and the whole world will obey the word to the T. All the redundant repetitions in this chapter communicate its power. One word, one action. Nebuchadnezzar's will be done. Except Daniel's 3 friends. Now I'm guessing that the text doesn't tell us what the image stands for because it doesn't matter. This is about power. You see, Nebuchadnezzar didn't really care about people's religion or theology. What he cares about was that if he says so, his will be done. Even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that name keep repeating over and over again. It reminds us it's because of him who gave them those Babylonian names. And this shall be how they are remembered. See, to him, everything was a power struggle. Have you wondered what it's like to have that much power? How does a person get this much power? Are some of us more special than the others? How does power work? And how do I get it? Who made kings? Gods? Stars? The all-seeing eye? Deep state? The League of Shadows? The story we tell ourselves. You see, we're not so different from the ancient people. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood at the bridge as if it were. Verse 19. Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed. Now notice the play on words. The expression, now the Aramaic is the image of his face was changed. Same word. Aramaic or Hebrew, tselem. Used 11 times already in this chapter, but also in Genesis 1. Now this irony is all the more striking when we bring the other two relevant texts. Let's take a look briefly at Deuteronomy chapter 4. Chapter 4. You don't have to turn there. I have the text up there. There, the context is on the Moab, on the plains of Moab. Moses gave Israel one last parting warning as they prepared to enter the land. He recalled the encounter with the reality of God at Sinai. Both what they saw, the fire, the smoke, the darkness of God's presence, the overwhelming out of this world sense of dread, but also what they didn't see, any form of God. And this was why they were not to give God a form, nor worship any image. And he goes on to repeat the Ten Commandments. That's the reality with a capital R, who had brought them out of, notice what it says, the iron furnace out of Egypt. Ironic, isn't it? Now the same image is repeated, by the way, by Solomon as he dedicated temples in 7 days. You see, Nebuchadnezzar sees everything as a story power struggle, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego sees it as something else. Now, on the whole, I get the sense that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did what they did, not because they thought they could stand against Nebuchadnezzar, but because they were convinced by a different story. But they weren't so dumb and clueless that they were convinced by a different story simply because it was a different story. Rather, they inherited an awareness of a reality centuries in the making, with history and prophecy and generations of testimonies. They lived and relived the story which shattered the illusion of all human stories, much like the stone that was not cut by human hands in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. It was a hard lesson learned, and not just by one or two individuals or a family, but the whole nation. Even as they go to exile, that was part of the hard lesson. And at the core of that lesson was a contrast articulated by Isaiah. Thus says the Lord, the King of Israel and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts. I am the first, and I am the last. Besides me, there is no God. Who is like me? Let him proclaim it. Let him declare and set it before me. Since I appointed an ancient people, let them declare what is to come and what will happen. You see, this is not about Bushido. This is not about the Marine motto, Semper Fi. This is about the reality of who God is. Who God is. This vantage point helps us then ask the right questions when we come to the text of Daniel chapter 3. But if you can't wrap your head around this reality, if you still kind of all wrapped up in the human story power struggle, then Nebuchadnezzar's response makes perfect sense. First, he is filled with fury. In fact, on the textual level, it's hard to figure out which is hotter, Nebuchadnezzar or the fiery furnace. Second, he throws everything in his power, everything, to squish the descendants like bugs. He wants the furnace 7 times hotter, meaning it's hot as it gets. And then verse 20, and he orders some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fire furnace. Because the king's order was urgent, and the furnace overheated. The flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. In the process, there's a great irony. There's a great irony woven into the story. I don't want you to miss it. You see, the mighty men of the army who bow down to the golden image, who obey Nebuchadnezzar, they couldn't escape the fire of the furnace. But the helpless, the powerless, the resourceless, who refused to obey, they weren't even singed. Even their clothes were perfectly preserved, with not so much as the smell of fire. Verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, Do we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, True, O king. He answered and said, But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. By the way, Nebuchadnezzar says that when he says a son of gods, he's not making a theological statement. He's simply repeating what he thinks he saw. And there's nothing inherent in the text that identifies this 4th man with Jesus or with the angel. We just don't know. Not saying that they're not, but we just don't know. But what we do know is this, that this is a supernatural being from God. Here, not only to deliver his people, but to, get this, to join them in the fiery furnace. In contrast, think about this. Forget about joining them. Neither Nebuchadnezzar nor his golden image could save his own worshippers. It's not the perfect summary of idolatry. Verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of these men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. You see, with all the power, with all of his authority, with even the power of a red-hot furnace, Nebuchadnezzar couldn't even singe a hair. And he couldn't save his own men. But what he could not, God could. No muss, no fuss, and that's the point. The point is clear. This is the answer to the question, who is the God who will deliver you? This God. Now, the interesting thing here is that there's a debate going back to verse 17 about exactly what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego meant. By the way, you want to pay attention here because I read this message to Anita 4 times. It was on the fourth time she says, oh. I'm pretty sure you guys can do better. Maybe not. I don't know. Verse 17. That was a line that was approved by her. Verse 17. What exactly did Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego said, and what did they mean? Verse 17, if this be so, if this be so, meaning thrown into the fiery furnace, our God whom we serve is able. to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. Most English translations follow ESV here. If we're thrown into the fiery furnace, if, that's the idea, the God we serve is able to save us. But if not, we're not going to bow down. Now, that's great courage and great theology. If only we could all live into that theology, that God is able, and yet he is sovereign, and we're not to presume that he will. Absolutely right. However, there's a possibility that this passage is not quite about that. From what I've read, and I'm no Aramaic expert, but from what I've read, people debate this, and that the majority of translators concede that grammatically, and we're talking about simply on grammatical basis, grammatically, a more likely and a more natural translation is, if the God whom we serve is able. If the God whom we serve is able to save us, then he will. If God is able. But that sounds like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't even sure if God was able. And that makes most translators uncomfortable on theological grounds. You see, we like our Bible heroes to have great faith and to stand their ground like Horatius at the bridge because it is inspiring. But what if? What if the point is not about men's great faith? What if the point is not so much about us, but about God? What if the point is about fearing God even when our faith is weak? See, I don't know about you, but I found this enormously more comforting when I began to realize that maybe they didn't have the perfect faith. When we find ourselves in a desert, whether as exiles to Babylon in the 6th century BC, or as peculiar people, strangers and aliens in Exodus in the 21st century AD, when we see no signs of God's prevailing kingdom, when we see no signs of what we consider to be the power of God and his kingdom, and our faith is weak, what do? How do we remain faithful then? The answer? We raise our eyes away from ourselves, away from our stories, away from the powers that be, away from the fiery furnace before us, from the Nebuchadnezzars of this age, to the one who says, I am the first, I am the last, besides me there is no God. I think the Old Testament term for this is the fear of God. The fear of God. Now, it's going to take a while before Nebuchadnezzar finally grasps this fear of God. At this point, though, he's simply impressed. He's impressed. He's impressed by the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has shown himself capable of doing exactly what he thought no gods could, to deliver them out of his hands. And he is impressed by the fearless devotion of 3 men who were willing to die. Verse 28. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusting him. See, he was very impressed about their decision, and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own gods. But notice this, that in his mind, this is still their God, not his God, or the only God, even though he's willing to concede that this is the most high God. See, Nebuchadnezzar is still living the story of power. The difference is he now concedes the power of Israel's God. He is still the same narcissistic despot who acts as if he is in charge. Verse 29. Therefore, I make a decree. He began by making a decree, ends by making a decree. Any people nation or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn, limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. He doesn't quite get the true fear of God. Now, you say, well, what is the true fear of God then? That is the right question to ask. It's really at the heart of the whole theme of kingdom confidence, the fear of God. The fear of God, like all fear, is not just reverence and respect. It is, but it's more. It is a strong emotion for sure. But it's not the kind of emotion that bubbles up out of nowhere from inside. Rather, it comes from experiencing a reality outside. A reality so big that it blows up my little world. Now, this is too immense for this time and space here. So I like to recommend a book, Recovering Our Sanity, by Michael Horton from Westminster Theological Seminary, California. And once you can read the book to get you started. For the time being, though, let me just clarify briefly what it is and what it is not. What it is not. The fear of God is not simply a fear of judgment. Even the fear of hell, it is not the same as the fear of God. Because the fear of God is not a means to an end, but the end itself. You see, we don't fear God for something else. God is the point. We don't use the so-called fear of God to coerce people to church, to manipulate young people to be more like us. The fear of God is not a slogan for national revival or a moralistic cause. Now, I'm not saying the doctrine of judgment is not important. It is. But we don't use God to make a point. God is the point. So what is it then? What is the fear of God? Well, it's a dread like no other dread that makes us fall on our faces and cry, woe is me, like Isaiah. But at the same time, it is also encountering a beauty so sublime, so immense that we are unable to look away. It's a fear that is also worship. Because God is not simply power. He is utterly out of this world and altogether different. He stands as the true, ultimate. There's nothing behind. His power is unfathomable, yes. But who he is so much more and so immense, and his joy is so deep, that when we encounter him, we want to get closer and run away at the same time. The fear of God. To the degree we lack this proper fear of God, and to that degree then, we'll be filled with the fear of everything else. You only need to glance at the conversations on social media and the political ads on TV to see what Michael Horton calls a pandemic of fear. That's the time we live in. A pandemic of fear. We fear big government, small government, inflation, loss of income, extreme ideologies, unfair elections, immigration, depression, diseases, aging, severe weather events, wars, injustices, our rights being taken away. We fear to be shut out of the halls of power, to miss out, to be cast away from our own tribe. We fear losing influence. We fear threats to our neighborhood and our vision of the good life. We fear the future. We fear the past. And then in my case, there's that lingering low-level anxiety that whatever there is, whatever I have, it is not going to be enough. We fear to be unhappy. What do we do? What do we do? Michael Horton says that the only antidote is not our courage, but the fear of God. You see, we don't displace fear with the absence of fear, but with the presence of a different kind of fear. The proper fear of God drives out the fear of everything else, including the improper fear of God. And I believe that's what these three men have. Not so much about their courage, but they have learned an awareness and of a reality, and they understood the fear that is also worship. What we have in Daniel 3 then is less like Horatius at the bridge or the marine model Semper Fidelis. What we have here is three ordinary persons. Three ordinary persons who lift up their eyes away from themselves to heaven, because they've lived into the story of the transcendent reality that drains the colors away from all the other stories, including Nebuchadnezzar's story of power. It couldn't take hold of them. What they encounter, though, is not simply an out-of-this-world power, but what they encounter is that out-of-world power, that out-of-world, a holy other God becomes so near that he joins them in the furnace. If you live into that story of transcendent reality, the fear of God, not your courage, but the fear of God will make you laugh at any other story that puts human beings in charge. You see, instead of men's simplify, always faithful, you'll experience God's semper presence, always present, even in the midst of your desert and furnace. Let's pray together. Father, you are the first, and you are the last. There is none besides you. And as we grasp what that means, there's that sense of dread, and yet also the sense of worship. And we thank you that in the love of Christ, you drive out the improper fear, but you deepen the proper fear that is both worship and love. And help us to grasp that we may know that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us always. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.